Time for a beach read. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today I have a review of Scuttler's Cove by David Barnett. This is being published in February 2025 by Canelo, and I received a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. And this is a contemporary folk horror story that is mixed with some cosmic horror flavors, and instead of being set in a forest, is set in a small coastal village, and I am here for it. I think this is an incredible addition to the contemporary folk horror canon, and if you like folk horror at all, I think you should jump into this story. The story is set in this small coastal village, Scuttler's Cove, in Cornwall, and this village has a long history, as you can imagine. All folk horror stories involve a small town that has a long history, and the sense of atmosphere, the sense of place, the world building is done really, really well. You can tell this small town is a tourist town that resents being a tourist town. And on top of that, they're slowly being overwhelmed by the wealthy Londoners who are coming and having summer homes there, who are pricing out all the locals. So there is this brooding resentment for all the town people, and it's just palpable. I think the world building goes a long way to let you feel that. So you really feel present in this town. So right away, you get immersed into this town, which I think is really, really skillfully done. And because of that immersive world building, you don't trust anyone, and no one in the town trusts each other. And I think that, there's this dark kind of ancient history to the town, but because of that, there are rituals, there are practices, there are ideas, there are beliefs that are not spoken about, at least not publicly, and there is a lack of trust, both from the outsider and from insiders. And I think that is really well executed in the story. And what I also appreciate is that the fact that this town is being overrun by tourists and by the wealthy city people is an important part of the story. It's not just added color. Like, part of the narrative thrust of the story has to do with these small towns being overrun, and with locals being priced out, with all of your heritage being trampled over by people that are looking for beautiful coastlines. And so the story has something to say, right? Which I think is really interesting. And again, folk horror is almost always the old and the new clashing. It almost always has to do with an outsider coming to a place they don't belong. And so that is really developed well in the story, as you see the elites slowly taking over this coastal town, but not knowing what they're getting into. Yet they aren't the main heart of the story. They are just the kind of setup for the story. The main story follows two women, right? One of them, a woman named Merrin, who was born and raised in Scuttler's Cove, but she left when she was a teenager to go to college and is only coming back now in her 30s. She hasn't been back her whole life. Her relationship has broken up. She's an artist, but not really succeeding. And she finds out her mother died, so she is returning to town, not only to kind of finalize her mother's affairs, but she decides this is like a new start for her life, since everything isn't going well for her in the city. She figures she'll just inherit her mother's house where she grew up, and she will start fresh. But when she gets there, she finds out that the house had been sold to the bank. So this new start to her life is not incredibly auspicious, especially because when she gets back, there are some townspeople who are very, very happy to have her back, and others who only want her to leave. And so she feels like an outsider in her hometown. She has memories of what it was like to grow up here, but they're fleeting and they're far between, and she doesn't know why. She doesn't even know why she hasn't been back over the last 15, 20 years. So she is struggling with all this and with these feelings of being both an insider and an outsider at the same time, being totally displaced. So she is one of our main characters. But then our other main character is a woman named Jen, who is one of these wealthy elite who are coming in, taking over the town. But not really. She married an incredibly wealthy man who died almost immediately after they were married. So she is this incredibly wealthy widow. Yet his incredibly wealthy friend group have already accepted her as one of them. And this incredibly rich group of people, every summer they do something different. And so this summer they've all bought houses in this small village, and they're going to summer in this small village. So she has a giant house that her husband and she bought right before he died. And so she is with this group of these snobby elites who are there, and they say they accept her, but she still feels like an outsider among them. And then they themselves are outsiders in this town because they are part of the occupying force, essentially, who are taking over this town. And so she feels like a double outsider in that way. She can't really feel connected to these other rich people, but she doesn't also connect with the locals because they resent her being there. So these are our two main characters, Jen and Merrin, and most of the chapters go back and forth between their points of view. Though there are a few other character POVs that are thrown in, and because of that, I think the story is really dynamic. I really appreciate that we have two different women who are both facing this feeling of being an outsider, of not fitting in, of trying to restart their lives having gone through something traumatic, but they're coming at it from different angles and they're facing different obstacles in the same environment. I think that's really exciting because it creates tension and it shows more than one side of this town. And in some way, you see the kind of cosmic elements and you see the folk horror elements represented in these two characters, which I think is really interesting because you don't trust any of these rich elite assholes from London, and you don't really trust the townspeople, even though you want to. The tensions and the way folk horror and these cosmic ideas mix together with these two groups of locals and outsiders, and then these two women who are both outsiders in their own way. I think this is really well crafted and it's well done, and you feel for both of these characters. I think these two main characters, Jen and Marin, are both exciting, they're dynamic, they feel real, they feel lived in, you empathize with them almost immediately. You know, they really are fish out of water, and they want to fit in. They want to find a place in the world. They want to heal from whatever kind of trauma they've experienced in their recent past, but they don't know how to. Those two characters are really, really well developed. Now, the rest of the characters are a little bit one note, but I think that's okay. So the townspeople, there are different townspeople that have different opinions about whether Marin should be there or not. None of them want the tourists there. And, you know, all of the town, never mind the really wealthy elites who are buying up all the property and pricing the tourists out, the town itself is a tourist town, and it makes most of its revenue over the summer months when tourists come to visit. And there's always like a resentment, right, with most tourist towns like this, that they don't want the tourists there, but they need the tourists there. And you can see that in the different characters who are villagers, who are insiders, who are locals. There is a little bit one note to all of them, but they all fit into the tapestry really well. And the same goes for all of these, you know, city folk, the wealthy city folk who are coming in, who are colonizing, who are the occupiers in some way, that they are all over the top. Right? They all are a little bit extreme and they feel a little exaggerated in that way, but they also feel genuine. They don't have a lot of depth to them necessarily because this isn't their story. This is really the story of Jen and Marin and how they fit into this village. And all of the locals and all of the outsiders are all part of the background noise to create a story for Jen and Marin. Even though these ancillary characters don't have a lot of depth, they work for the story. They really make the story broader and they fill in all the details of the town and of the environment and of the atmosphere in a really, really interesting way. They keep the story exciting. So you have this really atmospheric setting, which is really well done. You have exciting central characters. Now, the writing itself is playful, it's direct. Like I said, it tinges on the cosmic and the folk. So there's always this kind of narrative style of telling a story, right? Like that's a big element of folk horror, is that folk horror are stories told within stories, legends told within stories, you know, advice given and then broken. So there is this kind of element or this thrust to it, which works really well. The writing itself is direct. It's not ostentatious. It's not very colorful or like poetic, but it feels very appropriate for this small coastal village, right? It really feels down to earth. It feels like sandy and grainy almost. And I really appreciate that. I think the writing does a great job of pulling you through, and it really keeps everything interesting and moving at a good pace. You never get bogged down. And especially as you move from different points of view, for the first few chapters, you're only going back and forth between Jen and Marin, but then later on, a few other POVs are added in, and I think the juggling of all these POVs is really skillfully done. I think it's not excessive. It still lets you have this intimate relationship with our main characters, but then it gives you outside perspectives and it gives you more knowledge that they don't have, which then lets you empathize with them more because you see what's going on around them. You see the plans that are happening around them that they are stuck in the middle of and they're not aware of. So I think the handling of different POVs keeps the story dynamic, and it is done really well. Now, I think the plotting in the middle of the book lags a little bit. The first act and the final act, I think, are really well plotted out. The middle tends to drag a little bit. Now, it's not boring. Like, I'm never feeling like I want to put this book down, but it does just feel stretched out. And I think part of that is that there are mysteries to this island, and he doesn't want to give away the mysteries too quickly. So there are a few red herrings, there are a few misdirects, and those are all fine. I appreciate them as part of like a narrative structure, but it just feels like this central part feels a little padded. Do you know what I mean? It's not a long novel, and so maybe that's why there's this need to just give you a little more oomph in the middle, and I can appreciate that. And like I said, it's never boring. Like, it always pulls you through. You're always invested in whatever is going to happen next. I just think it was a little bit more padded out than it had to be, but that's okay. I still really had a good time with it. So I don't want to give away too much more of the plot or what happens, except to say that both of our characters go on this journey, and both of our characters are exploring what it means to be an outsider, and what it means to rely on others to overcome your own grief and your own trauma. Both of them are coming from very difficult situations. They both experienced death very recently, one of them her mother and the other one her husband, and they are both trying to navigate their lives. They're trying to understand who they are in the world. They're both young women in their 30s trying to reinvent or restart their lives, having gone through such difficulty, finding themselves in this small town which has such promise for them, but such danger at the same time. And so they want to fit in. They want to find a crowd of people who they can lean on, who they can be supported by, and yet they feel like a perpetual outsider. So these ideas are being played with, which I think is common in folk horror in general, but he does a really great job of it. The balance of looking at what it means to fit in or wanting to fit in, but also wanting to be self-sufficient, I think is really interesting to explore that dynamic. And so seeing the journeys our two main characters go on, I think is really, really exciting. And the ideas that he plays with, not just wanting to fit in, not just being an outsider, but what does it mean to go home? What does it mean to return to something you no longer remember? And then having all of those wrapped up in these ideas of almost colonialist aspect of these really wealthy elite taking over small towns, pricing out locals. What does it mean when your lifestyle and your traditions and your heritage become a commodity that is being sold? It is being packaged and sold to others. What do you lose about yourself when the most important parts of who you are being sold away? I think those are all interesting ideas, and there's no preachiness about them, but they're the undertow that keeps this whole story like in its grasp, and it keeps the story moving and spinning around. If you like folk horror, I think you're gonna have a great time with this story. I know I did. I really appreciated, especially having folk horror moved out of the forest and into the ocean. So much of folk horror is set in some, remote forest somewhere, so I thought this was a refreshing change. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have any of you read this yet? Have you read any of David Barnett's other books? Or do you have any recommendations of other folk horror stories, especially folk horror that takes place in unlikely locations instead of in the forest, taking place on a coastal village like this one, or anything like that? I'd love to hear your suggestions and comments down below. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.